So I hope you join us and enjoy this presentation. So let us start.
Thank you. Thank you. Whoa. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, all of you. Do you know if the universe had a scoreboard where it was keeping track of things, you would get 100 extra points for coming out in this weather. Okay? So props to you all. I want to make sure that we also recognize other members of the Lost Souls Public Memorial Project who are here. Ms. Toni Hendricks is here representing the NAACP New Brunswick chapter, and Sydney Drake, who's here from the Afro-American Genealogical and Historical Association New Jersey chapter. You'll hear more about us, but we are a multiracial, multicultural, grassroots group that is very committed to the story that you're about to hear, to righting wrongs that have happened, and to remembering the lost souls back home. As Amy said, my name is I'm Karen Johnston. I'm the minister at the Unitarian Society in East Brunswick, and I'm going to start us off telling kind of the whole story in the round, both of the history and the project. Then you'll hear from Dr. Peter Kahn about the inspiration that has brought us to think of a memorial, and then you'll hear from really the person who's become our public historian, Kristal Langford, about the deep history that some knew, more know, and she has uncovered, like even just a few weeks ago. It's really, really exciting. So I'm going to give you a quote to start us off. If you are anywhere on this continent and in a space that is white only or white majority, it wasn't always that way. Start there. Start with that story and see where it takes you. So said one of the wise faith leaders in my tradition just a few years ago when I was at a workshop. Already I had planned to meet with a local historian to learn more about the indigenous people of New Jersey. I am not from New Jersey. I have been here 3.5 years, and I thank those of you who are New Jerseyans for letting me come. But I knew, because home is so important, that knowing the land and the people are so important, that there were big gaps in my knowledge base and I needed to do better. And so I met with this local historian thinking that I was going to learn about the Lenape, and I did. But the congregation I serve is in East Brunswick, and this historian is based out of East Brunswick. And he told me a story that I did not expect to hear, a horrific story that we are going to share with you. And maybe you have heard of it, because we are not the first to engage with it, but each time historians have tried to uncover and share it, it has been whitewashed. Enough so that there is a street in East Brunswick named after the man who led the slave ring. A street named after him. So we know that there are patterns and patterns of whitewashing, and our presence here is to put an end to that. In our little corner of the world, because right, can I get an amen? It's much larger than what we little people can do, but we're trying. It was 1818. 14 years earlier, in 1804, slavery had been outlawed in New Jersey, but as probably you know, only in a gradual way. So that it would allow, by the time of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865, that there were still 16 enslaved African Americans in the state. The numbers don't add up. I'm not quite sure how that could be, except for that white supremacy culture. Until 1812, the law allowed for the removal of enslaved people or apprentices out of state with their own assent or that of their mother. Okay? So those are the dates just before, and then comes 1818, and a Middlesex County judge who resided in what is now East Brunswick, because East Brunswick was incorporated in 1860. He used his own home as a courtroom. He used a loophole in the law, and he used deception to sell, for his own profit, 180 African Americans into permanent slavery by sending them to the Deep South. These were people who were both free and still legally enslaved, of course not morally. These were men, women, and a child as young as 2 days old. They were Harriet and Susan and Mary and Augustus and Regina, who was 6 weeks old, and her mother Rachel. They were Diana and Hercules and Dorcas. There was Nancy, 22 years old, and it was her son, who was just 2 days old, unnamed at the time of the so-called court hearing. 10 days later, on the ship, his name was Joseph. How can we ever heal if we do not tend to these wounds? How can we be whole if we do not remember the lost souls back home? The slave ring operated from February to October, although that will get a little bit wonky when Kristal shares some more information. And we know 141 names, 3 of which Ms. Langford found 3 weeks ago. We know that there was a ship, ironically named the Bliss, that carried 39 people whose names we have not yet recovered, but we know they exist. We see name changes, we see absences from manifests, the difference between Perth Amboy and the New Orleans port. So we think that some died on the way south. Or we think also that there was intentionally inaccurate deception in the recording of these manifests. Deceptions like stating that individuals were at least 14 years old to deflect the attention of authorities, like Hannah Johnston, who was listed as 20 years old and also listed as 4 feet 10 inches. Now, it's possible a grown woman was 4 feet 10 inches, but it's also possible that she was not yet full grown, not yet an adult, more likely a child who was wrongly listed as adult. 2 years ago, just 2 years ago, we knew of 85 names. We guessed there were more, and as I said, we now know there are 180, and we hold the list of names quite loosely, recognizing that we may well learn of others whose freedom and lives were stolen, others who were removed from our wider community. I say more of their names. I want you to remember them. There was Elizabeth Ann Turner, who was 16. Susan Jackson, 20. Kahn, 22. Jack, 22. Lewis, 22. Peter, 14. Frank, 21. Caleb Groves, 50. You may have noticed I have not yet given you the name of this corrupt judge. That's on purpose. We want you to remember the lost souls. We want to center them, not the story of the corrupt, racist, greed-driven judge who stole their freedom. We will not forget him, but we will not make him the center of the story we remember. I want to share with you the words of Brian Stevenson, civil rights lawyer, author of Just Mercy, and of course there's two new movies, right? One Hollywood version and one a documentary. MacArthur genius, right? Founder of Equal Justice Initiative and the moving force behind the poignant and powerful memorial related to both slavery and lynching in our nation. He said, "We hadn't created spaces in America that deal honestly with the legacy of slavery. My view is that the great evil in American slavery wasn't actually involuntary servitude or enforced labor. It was the narrative of racial difference that we created in order to justify that system. We said black people are different than white people, they can't do this, they can't do that, and then we used the Supreme Court to say they were 3/5 human. And this ideology of white supremacy, that narrative of racial difference, that was the true evil, is the true evil. How can we be whole if we do not remember these lost souls back home? How can we ever heal if we do not tend to the wounds? I have told you about the slave ring, I have told you about the lost souls, and I want to tell you that the slave ring was brought to an end. And it was. In that same year, in 1818, a small group of people, a small group of white people, and given the era, a small group of white men. And by small, I mean it was described at the time in a local paper as thinly attended. If any of you belong to houses of worship, you have been to committee meetings, I know you have, and you have said, this is thinly attended. Still they met, and not just in one place, but in 3 New Jersey counties altogether. They petitioned the state assembly, and in an unusual instance, justice was swift. On October 31st, 1818, an act to prohibit the exportation of slaves or servants of color out of New Jersey was introduced. 4 days later, the bill was taken up, amended slightly, and voted upon. It passed unanimously. 2 days later, New Jersey petitioned the U.S. Congress to end the illegal interstate slave trade. This was not typical for New Jersey, right? New Jersey was the last state to do anything positive about slavery, so I don't know why, in that moment, things worked as well as they did. Perhaps those of you in this room, some of you, all of you, know that in the period running up to the Civil War, there is what is called in our national history the Second Middle Passage. Right? And the first Middle Passage is that process when Africans were stolen away, primarily from West Africa, forcibly brought to this continent, forcibly brought to the Caribbean and parts of Europe as slaves. It is believed that at least 2 million Africans lost their lives as part of the Middle Passage. And that does not count the twice that amount who died between being stolen from their homes and brought to the coastal ports where they were loaded onto ships. So that is the Middle Passage, but the Second Middle Passage is a time when approximately 835,000 African Americans were moved either from the northern part of the South or from the North itself into the Deep South, overland and by boat, moved from these places in order to secure a more permanent slavery. If you've watched 12 Years a Slave, you know one of the narratives, the truth of this second middle passage. And The Lost Souls is another version of this. It's documented that enslaved peoples most feared being moved to Louisiana, fearing it a death sentence given the harsh conditions there. And that destination, along with Mississippi, is where, as far as we know, most or all of the lost souls ended up. Our nation has been for a very long time grappling with what kind of monuments do we build and which ones do we raise and take down. And that conversation, that engagement has heightened in the last few years. It seems whenever white supremacy culture rears its ugly head, this is one of the ways that it happens. I don't know if you had a chance not too long ago, Kehinde Wiley, an artist, he did the portrait of President Obama. He created this 27-foot monument that was temporarily in Times Square. It's called Rumors of War. Really powerful piece. So it was there on purpose temporarily and then moved to Richmond, Virginia, to the Avenue of the Confederacy, I believe it's called. Not actually to there, but to a street that intersects it, called Arthur Ashe Boulevard, because Arthur Ashe was born there. And then we talk about streets intersecting. I like to think of that as disrupting, interrupting white supremacy, choosing to have that powerful monument be there among all those monuments to the Confederacy. I think also in New York, the recent removal of the monument of J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of gynecology, who performed brutal experiments on enslaved African American women, being replaced by one designed by a local artist, Vinnie Bagwell, called Victory, which has support within the local community, scheduled to be installed in 2021. And then here in the Garden State, there are many efforts, but I can tell you about the one that we are associated with, the Lost Souls Public Memorial, founded by the coming together of several individuals and 2 local African American community groups, currently housed at the congregation I serve, the Unitarian Society in East Brunswick. We are working towards growing community awareness and engagement in this part of our history, and to build a public memorial so that this history is not lost, and more importantly, that the lost souls stolen away from local communities, sold into permanent slavery, are remembered back home. So far, we've received 2 small and wonderful grants, both from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, which has allowed us to do deep planning. We've received some financial support from the Magyar Community Bank. The Council's involvement gave us our first statewide recognition that has helped us build legitimacy and wider support. And last year we received our first national recognition when we won a Social Justice Award. And we hope that it is, yes, our first, but not our last. Last August, along with the mayor of East Brunswick, we picked out what we hope and anticipate will be the future site of the memorial. We are in process of consolidating that partnership with the township, and it's been a gift and a blessing to have the support, proactive support of the mayor. What comes next? We ask that after today and after our conversation, you will share this history widely. You will engage it. You might financially support it. You might attend more of our events. We are planning in May to release the request for proposals so that the community artists can give us the vision of what this memorial might be. And we need grant writers and fundraisers because we are not going small. We want to build something that will really provide the proper reverence for what happened here. If you are willing to come south to East Brunswick on May 19th, we hope you will. We'll be holding our third recitation of the names. So we don't have a formal memorial yet, so we, once a year, get together and we say all the names that we know, including silence for those 39 we know exist, but do not have their names. The first year we did that, we did it on the site of where that house was that held them captive. There's a power substation there, so it was not pretty, but it was deep. My phone, isn't that horrible? It's better that it's my phone and not your phone, right? Our second recitation of names was also a deep experience, and we were blessed to have the poet Glennis Redmond, who has been for over a decade the resident poet at State Theater, New Jersey. She gave us a poem both through her hands and writing and through her embodiment that honors the lost souls. We have been lucky. And we hope that after today, and you hear more from Dr. Kahn and Ms. Langford, that you will become part of the great universe of people who are cheering on and maybe making happen the Lost Souls Public Memorial. I'd like to hand the mic over to Dr. Kahn now.
I am of Jewish ancestry and training. Although I no longer go to the synagogue, I'm a member of long-standing of the congregation of which Reverend Karen is the minister, the Unitarian Society in East Brunswick. In the summer of 2017, my wife and I went to Berlin to visit friends of long-standing. One of them, Chava Boyarin, originally from Slovakia and then Israel and now the United States, took us to a disused railway siding in the far western part of Berlin. That railway siding was used as a point of deportation for Jews from Berlin. When the Nazis deported Jews from Berlin to the death camps, most of those people came from the eastern part of the city and were working class. They could have been sent by trains loaded onto boxcars at any of a number of railway stations in the eastern part of the city. But the Nazis didn't do that. They sent them by trucks to the far westernmost part, the wealthiest part of the city then and now. Because they were afraid that the working class neighbors of the Jewish people would rise up in protest when they saw their neighbors and friends being deported. And so, boxcar load after boxcar load of people were taken to that railway siding, which has now come to be called Platform 17. They were loaded onto boxcars and then sent off. The picture you see is a memorial outside that station, the Grunwald station. And the figures of people vaguely outlined on that wall are embedded as part of the wall. There on the left you see a woman, my wife as it turns out, looking at one of those. And on the right, she and our friend Chava are walking along the railway siding. The material that they're walking on is metal, and you can see vaguely strips along the right-hand side. What these say is what you see here. This goes on for a distance of somewhat over a quarter of a mile on both sides of the track. Each of those plates is about this wide and about that tall. And engraved on each plate is a date, in that case November 11th, 1941, the number of Jews deported on that day, and the fact that they went to the concentration camp in Minsk from Berlin. Minsk is in what is now Belarus. Another one, November 1st, 1941, just over 1,000 Jews from Berlin to the camp at Lodz, which was an extermination camp as well. And here we have 63 to Theresienstadt. And here we have 1,190 from Berlin to Auschwitz. It was an overwhelming feeling to walk that track. A cousin of my grandfather, who lived in Frankfurt and did not get out, he was a doctor, he was well known in Frankfurt in civic affairs. When the Nazis took power, they took away his medical license to practice on anybody except Jews. After a while, they took away his license to practice on anybody. Then they took his house, and he had to move to a small apartment. And after some time, he got a formal letter from the Nazis telling him to prepare for deportation on a certain day. And by that time, he knew exactly what that would mean. And so he and his wife committed suicide. And they are buried in the Jewish cemetery in Frankfurt. So I have a direct feeling that the viciousness of prejudice can affect anybody. Me, you, doesn't matter who. When we came home, the slave ring had been discovered, and the first thing that we thought of in the Unitarian Society and some others was we ought to go and get that road renamed. About 40 years ago, builders in East Brunswick were building houses and they needed street names, and so they cast about for families that had been common back in the day. They found the family of the judge, and so there is a road named after him. And so he drew up a one-page petition to the town council to have the street renamed. But as we were doing this, it occurred to me that what if we succeed? The whole thing was forgotten after 1818. There was nothing to prevent it from being forgotten again, because that's the way such things are done in this country. They get forgotten. And so I wrote up another one side of the page, and it was put on the back of the proposal to rename the street. And the proposal was to create some kind of memorial. There's no way the town council could act on such a thing. It was just a proposal put out there to be acted on somehow in the future. We were not as well organized then as we are now. And as it has turned out, the council has not got around to renaming the street. They've just sort of let it go away. And I suspect the street will not get renamed until after the memorial is built, because that will build the public pressure that will rename the street. Somewhere in the Bible, there is the statement, lest we forget. I am not free if you are not. While anybody is constrained by the legacy of slavery or any form of bigotry, none of us is safe. That's why I'm putting in a very large amount of my time and effort, and many others in this room are doing the same thing, and others not here at the moment. It's sometimes said that those who do not remember history are destined to repeat it. I don't want to go there. I don't think anybody here wants to go there. And with that, I think I'll pass to Kristen.
As historians, we dig into the history of mankind to understand society as it was, with clues left behind, albeit diaries, journals, wills. We recreate the story. In this case, we recreated the narrative with court documents, wills, deposition, newspaper articles, court appeals. However, I won't take credit for discovering any of this because we have other historians who've dug into this history, trying to understand, the slavery from different lenses. However, what I will do, although I share with you the scheme behind the illegal slave trade, I also intend to invoke or insert the voices of the lost souls and the voices of the citizens in Middlesex County who objected to this business and subsequently put it into the practice. What we discovered was the blatant disregard, violation of human rights and their liberty. I'm sorry, I'm nervous. I am sorry. When I came upon this history, and I thank the Lost Souls for inviting me to be a part of this project. When I came upon this history, I knew nothing about it. I'm a doctoral student at Rutgers, learning African American history. However, when I came upon this took me, it just gripped me. And I'm a mother, I have 5 children. Learning, hearing, reading about the decisions that mothers had to make when it came to their children. I just couldn't separate myself from this. So I actually started digging. I did more than what the committee actually required. I started digging and digging and digging into this history because I really wanted to understand. And I really wanted to share with you guys what this man did. And it wasn't just him. And we're going to get into this history. So what actually happened was we have this individual who had a blatant disregard for human life, their liberty, their happiness, their freedom. He just didn't care. And sadly enough, it's the individuals who hold offices of public trust. We elected these folks. How these individuals actually came to engage in this violation was through this law. They actually exploited the law of 1804, which promised freedom to children born to enslaved mothers on or after July 4th, 1804. So what the law pretty much said was that if the child, once a girl reaches the age of 21, she is free. Once the boy reaches the age of 25, he is free. We manumit them. However, although these children were promised this freedom, they were still slaves. They were still enslaved, right? So the master could do what they want. They could send them out, in the term of apprentice, they could send them out in a sense and still recoup funds. So they would send them out to a plantation owner to till their land, right? And whatever money that they generated, obviously the master would get, some part of that fund, and then the slave owner would also, the master of that child would also receive some of that fund. In order to release that child from bondage, according to this law, they would need consent. Not only that, if you wanted to send that child out of the state, out of New Jersey, you also needed that child's consent, which you call assent, and the mother's, or even the father's, permission. So knowing that they had this kind of law in place, we have some individuals who actually exploited that. The law also required that an overseer of the poor and two justices, right, pretty much during an examination, they would confirm that the individuals agreed to go out of state or move to or be transferred to the hands of another slave owner. Because of his position, Jacob Van Winkle was aware of the law. However, his plan hadn't been birthed until his brother-in-law, Charles Morgan, paid him a visit. Charles Morgan actually, he was a resident of Louisiana. He had just purchased a plantation, and he needed folks to work his land. So his plan was actually to go to Virginia. However, en route to Virginia, he actually detoured and went to go visit Judge Jacob Van Winkle. He actually had $45,000 in hand. And as he explains, he's talking to Jacob Van Winkle about, what's going on with his life. He said, hey, listen, Judge Jacob Van Winkle said, hey, listen, you can actually get slaves here for pretty cheap, right? So in Louisiana, slaves were going for $800. However, Judge Van Winkle noticed that these slaves were going for $300. They were going for $300. So what he did was he He maximized his profit, right, buying slaves as little as $175, right? So with this in place, right, so he developed this plan with his brother-in-law. What he needed was other folks to be a part of the system, and he did just that. The list that I have before you is just a snippet of the folks who were involved in the slave ring, and they all played like different roles. So what he actually did was he first recruited, well, obviously we had Charles Morgan, then he recruited his son, right? Because according to the law, you couldn't sell an enslaved person or move an enslaved person out of state. So what he did was he had his son Nicholas Van Winkle to serve as an agent to Charles Morgan. So Nicholas's name is written all over court documents as an individual who owned slaves and is working on behalf of Charles Morgan. Charles Morgan also brought into the fold his brother-in-law. I wish this was a pointer. I wish this had a pointer. He brought into the fold his brother-in-law, Major General James Morgan, who was a former New Jersey congressman and a South Amboy slave owner. Elsie Morgan is also his daughter-in-law, who he brought into the slave ring. Right? So with these folks, each of them have their own connections, right? So they have connections with the slave traders, the folks who would transport the slaves from Van Winkle's house onto the dock. You have connections with the collector of the port. So you would have individuals who would go like Port Authority, who would go to Van Winkle's house, gather some information, right, to create the manifest and bring it back to the port. So they are all connected politically and blood relatives. Oh, also to note, I didn't want to, you have this guy right here. Isaac H. Williamson. He was a former governor of New Jersey. He was also the former mayor of Elizabeth, right? So he was also involved in the slave ring. And I'll get into detail in terms of how he was connected. So once all of this thing, right, so once all of these people are in place, the slave ring was able to, run smoothly. So also I wanted to mention, so you see the folks who own the ships, they're like they're relatives, like by marriage, to like Charles Morgan, as well as Jacob Van Winkle. So they're related by marriage. So again, he has his entire family tied up in the slave ring, along with the political networks. So once everyone is in place, the slave ring proceeds. So what I did here was to give you guys the process, like just to lay out how this thing would actually take place. So you have your actors, Charles Morgan, James Morgan, Elsie Morgan, right? So these folks, along with Jacob Van Winkle, they would actually go out and petition, right? So they'll go out to known plantation owners to inquire about their slaves, to let them know, hey, listen, I'm interested in purchasing your slaves. Just let me know whether or not you're interested in selling them. Peter Hendry, on the other hand, he actually kidnapped some freed black folks as well as children. So you have this individual who was, taking folks who were free and putting them in bondage. From there, if you have plantation owners who actually agreed to selling their slaves, what would happen is, because Nicholas Van Winkle acted as the intermediary, Charles Morgan and James Van Winkle would actually make payments on his behalf, right? So in a sense, what they did was they removed their hands from the ring, so it couldn't be traced, right? So they would make payments on behalf for the enslaved parents and their freeborn children. We must remember that they were freeborn, although by law they were still enslaved, but they were promised freedom. Once that took place, once they received payments, the slave owners would actually, over here, they would actually bring, right, these enslaved folks to Jacob Van Winkle's home. It was called the South River Establishment. In some newspaper accounts, they called it a garrison because it was like a prison, right? This is in present, well, we're talking about present day East Brunswick. As Reverend Karen had mentioned earlier, East Brunswick didn't become incorporated until 1860. His home was in South River. So once they bring these folks to Jacob Van Winkle's home, right, now you have the two judges. Judges Van Winkle, according to the law, we needed two. Judges Jacob Van Winkle and VWF Outcall, right? So they would conduct the examination to verify that these individuals agreed to be sold south, right? From there, you would have James Brewster, who is the collector of the port. He would send his assistant. He has an assistant named John Young. He would send them to the house and collect information, demographic information about the cargo, right? So again, to draft up the manifest. From there, once all of this is done, then you have your transporters, David Bloomfield, Isaac Letts, James Rickett. So they were paid like $4 to transport these individuals to the dock in South Amboy, and then they were loaded onto these packet boats. From there, the packet boats, they wait until the ship, actually it's called the brig Mary Ann from New York, right, arrives to Sandy Hook. Once that ship arrives to, the brig arrives to Sandy Hook, right, so you have the port inspectors who would inspect it, and once it's inspected and it's cleared, then these little packet boats, right, they would sail alongside the Mary Ann, right here. They were alongside Mary Ann and then transferred over. They would transfer these enslaved folks to the brig. Because the Mary Ann got its clearance, they were free to go to Louisiana. But something actually happened. So this is the process, and I'm pretty sure this is what happened with the another ship called it is the Bliss and the Thorn, right? So this is the process in terms of how everything went about. As I had mentioned earlier, right, so you have these individuals who are placed upon this boat. However, not without protest. And we know that they protested simply because of depositions of what passengers who were on this boat heard, right? So we know, according to the records, that these African Americans who were kidnapped or who were actually taken south were either deceived, they were, in many cases, exploited in terms of the institutions that we have, or kidnapped. In terms of the deception, Elsie Morgan, James Morgan, Charles Morgan, they would go around, right, and they took advantage of the economic situations of free black people who couldn't find employment. So they took advantage of that, and they promised them jobs. They said, hey, listen, if you come south, we'll pay you, we'll give you a job, you'll have employment. So of course, they jumped at the opportunity, right? So they got that consent in that sense, but they didn't know that they were going to be enslaved for life. Then you have the exploitation. With the exploitation, interestingly, New Jersey, the status of African Americans was ambiguous, right? So you could have a free person and an enslaved person walking down the street and you wouldn't know what their status is. So as a result, if a free person was walking down the street and a slave catcher assumed, right, that this person was a runaway, they would jail them. So you had, we had a jail in New Brunswick. We also had a jail in Newark. So what the law said was the slave's master, the person who was in jail, the master actually has 10 days to come and recoup their slave. However, if you're free, you have no one coming to pick you up after 10 days. So what ended up happening was the governor gave Jacob Van Winkle, permission to purchase these folks. So you have, again, we don't know, we have some folks who perhaps were freed, were free men who were sold south. Then you had the kidnapping. So Peter Hendry, so because of the laws concerning apprenticeship, right, so you would send these young children out to work the fields somewhere in someone else's plantation. What Peter would do was he would go and he kidnapped them. He kidnaps them and place them on the ship, ready to go. Another thing that they did was if you had individuals who were waiting for their cases to be heard, right, in the court system, they would get swept up from the court system. They would get swept up and brought to Van Winkle's home bounded, right? So we do have a case where this one individual, his hands were tied and his legs were tied and brought upon the ship. However, once they arrived to New Orleans, right, and they inquired about whether or not they were inquiring about these individuals, they realized some of the individuals on the boat actually said that they didn't agree. Right? They didn't agree to this, and that some of them even said that they were kidnapped. So you hear a lot of moaning. I know the history is heavy. I hear the sigh. The history is very, very heavy. Hearing about this and learning about this, right, through the newspaper. I'm not talking about now. I'm talking about like way back then. Newspaper reportings of the kidnappings and the enslavement of the children who were born otherwise free enraged citizens of Middlesex County, and not just Middlesex County, Essex County, and some other states as well. As a result of this public outrage, you had indictments for folks involved in the slave ring. However, we know of at least 3 who were found guilty. And the sad part about this is, although they were found guilty for kidnapping, they appealed, and that's the reason why we know they were charged and convicted. They actually appealed the conviction. We don't know if they succeeded, though. The public outrage, as Karen alluded to earlier, actually led to New Jersey enforcing the law, and it pretty much prohibited individuals who were engaging, selling, transferring, or assigning slaves servants out of the state. So pretty much, if you were found engaging in this practice, you would be held accountable. The sad part about it is that Judge Jacob Van Winkle, he was never held accountable for his actions in the slave ring. And just to let you guys know, the ships were actually seized. The Mary Ann and the Brig and the Thorn were both seized. They were seized because the Port Authority, the officials, they had a feeling that these folks were smuggled. They were brought to New Orleans illegally. And how we know this is because the manifest didn't match. Again, the ages didn't match. And what I actually have on the next page is the timeline of the violations of the human rights, of these known sailings. So to date, we know of, so where you see these circles, right? These are sailings that went out. We know of 5, right? So the law of 1804 was put in place. 1812, they made an amendment saying, okay, listen, we need 2 judges to consent. I mean, not consent, we need 2 judges to agree or to certify that these individuals agree to be removed out of the state. From there, we have our first 2 sailings in May. The first group departed from Sandy Hook, and then the second group departed on the Thorn. And then in July, again, we have another group that departed on the Bliss. We have a 4th group that departed from Perth Amboy October 26th. And then we have in November 5th, we have this law passed. And although the law passed, we still have another attempt, right? The 5th group that departed on November 7th. To date, as Karen mentioned earlier, at least, and I'm saying at least because we're still digging into this history, at least 180 lives were transformed as a result of Van Winkle's heinous venture. And we have learned the names of 141 souls. Thank you.
Amen.
You guys, it's up to us to act.
Amen.
It really is up to us to act. Because imagine if the citizens of Middlesex County didn't act. This slave ring would have continued, and we don't know how long. What we have here, what we actually have here is a certificate of removal, right? So, we have the name of the individual. We have the date that they were actually, it says February. Actually, let me see if I can read it for you guys, right? And we see this, it was like a pattern for every single one. It's the state of New Jersey, Middlesex County. Do hereby that on this 11th day of February, right? February in the year of our Lord, 1818, James Morgan, Esquire of the Township of South Amboy, in the County of Middlesex and the state, aforesaid brought before us Matthias Mount, Overseer of the Poor, in the Township of South Amboy, and John Alcolt and Jacob Van Winkle, Esquire, 2 of the justices of the peace, in the foresaid county of Middlesex, his male slave. Mind you, he didn't own anyone, right? Because of this deceit, right? It's like, okay, well, because of the way they design it, it's like, okay, well, I have to say that I own this individual, but really he didn't, right? They purchased him from somewhere else, right? His male slave named Simon, who on, can't see this, an examination of said male slave, he appears to us to be sound in mind and not under any bodily incapacity of obtaining a support, and also is not under the age of 21 years, 21 years, can't make out what this says, above the age of 40 or above the age of 40. And I can't make out the rest of this. I'm sorry, you guys. But this is like the certificate of removal. So you see Judge Van Winkle, Jacob Van Winkle, along with Alcolt, right? And there's another judge who participated in this as well. So you see this over and over again. The language is exactly the same. And this is the justification that they used to actually remove these individuals out of the state. So you had copies, right? So on the manifest, well, you had copies of not so much a certificate, but proof that these individuals actually agreed to go out of the state. So this is what they actually used when they were in New Orleans to prove to the port authority or the port collectors and say, hey, no, these individuals actually agreed they agreed to actually come and work in Louisiana. So this is the evidence that we have. If you guys have any questions in regards to this history, it's open. The floor is open.
These 180 lives, how were they brought together to be sent? I mean, aren't the people that were involved with that, sheriffs or deputies, weren't they just as guilty as...
Oh, very much so.
And what happened to them?
They weren't charged. They weren't charged. So far from what I found, I only found 4 individuals, which were Elsie Morgan, the daughter-in-law, James Morgan, Major General James Morgan, was Charles Morgan. There were only 4 who were actually charged and indicted. However, they were only charged not so much for participating in the slave ring. They were actually charged for selling children because they didn't receive their consent. They're children. You can't get consent from children, right, without their parents. That's the only reason why they were charged. But the officers, like everyone else that was involved, they weren't charged at all.
Do we know if any of the 180 lives descendants made it back up north?
And can you repeat the question? Do you want me to answer?
Here's the mic.
Yes.
Do we know that any of the 180 lives descendants made it back up north so that they can tell the story as well about their parents or families?
So when I spoke about how I met with a local historian to learn some of this. And so I want to be really clear, right? We are not the first, and you've said that as well too, right? We're just trying to bring further. So our group we don't know very much about that aspect, but that historian, he spoke about making potential contact with descendants, not folks who necessarily came up north, but we know that some of the lost souls ended up in Morganza, Mississippi, which was what the Charles Morgan plantation became named. And so that likely those folks, and it's a very small town that's been decimated by a brain drain, right? But some of those folks may be descendants. But we as a group don't have contact with them, though we think that that would be a wonderful piece of this wider prospect. The other thing is, and part of how we got invited here is that Amy knows Jean Armstead and Tony Armstead, who are part of the Afro-American Genealogical and Historical Association, New Jersey chapter. I try to get the whole thing in whenever I say the whole thing. I think at that same fair, somebody approached them and said, I think I'm descended from Van Wickle. Now, we haven't heard from them yet, but they took our email and we're hoping that at some point. And the other thing is that Kristal has been able to identify the list of people who signed in Middlesex County, not in Essex County, like the people who were at that meeting that said, we are bringing this to an end, and we hope to at some point get clear on that and reach out to them as well. In part, that will be easier because, as is always true, right, we have full names in a way that we have, as you can see from that list and what was up before, often just a first name.
When Reverend Karen mentioned that we're not in touch with people in Morganza, we know that there are descendants of the slaves deported south. We are, I guess, 8 or 10 people who constitute the steering committee for the project. And we have what we describe to ourselves as bandwidth problems, in that there's only a limited amount that 8 or 10 people can do who are volunteers, who have full-time jobs, families, and all the things that make for a life. We need people to come and join us and help. And one place people could help is in establishing good contacts with the people in Morganza.
Point coupe. I think there is a mic coming to you. If you could use that so all can hear.
I remember reading in August, the New York Times, the 1619, did you see that issue? Where when the slaves were sent to the Deep South, especially Louisiana, they would just work to death on the sugar plantations, cutting the sugar cane, because sugar was such a commodity that was wanted all over Europe and everywhere, that the slaves would just work so hard. And I guess they would die in the cane fields.
Right. The average life expectancy for slaves is 37 years old. So a lot of these plantation owners, slave owners, they would free their slaves at 35, knowing they would really only have like 2 good years left. It's like you broke them down, right? So.
And speaking of descendants, there was another article, probably a lot of people read it, about George Washington University, and how when they had financial troubles, they sold, well, first of all, the university was built by slaves. Then I think they had financial difficulty and they sold some to the Deep South. And recently, within the past, I don't know, 3-4 years, they were able to find some of the descendants. Did you read that? Georgetown. It was Georgetown.
Did they get, did they not get compensated to go to? Yes, that was the whole deal of that.
Right.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Our hope is through this work that descendants do contact us. So, sharing the story, because you just never know who you're speaking to, or who you're going to, come into contact with as you share this story. So.
Yes, I'm Bob Davis from the Senior Awareness Committee of Elizabeth in the County of Union. My question is, how do we get this into the Amistad program, right into our school system? I don't know how to do it, but if there's something that we can do as citizens of the United States and citizens of Union County, we'll try to do what we can. Senior Citizens Awareness Committee.
I'm actually in contact with folks on the Amistad Commission in regards to bringing this history, not even just this history, like local history, African American history, into the curriculum, because the Amistad Act has been put in place a while ago. It's just that the school districts aren't enforcing it. So we just need to put pressure on the school district to really teach this history.
And I'll also say that so we have multiple layers of the project. 1 is uncover the history, 2 is to build the public memorial, 3 is to create learning resources that can be used by civic organizations, houses of worship, and schools, right? And available for free on our website to be created into a curriculum that makes that suits. And so hopefully, as I don't know, the delays around Amistad are removed, the barriers are removed, that this will be one of the pieces, certainly for East Brunswick, but not only, right? It is local history to us, but it is regional, it's New Jersey, and it's national history. So I agree, and I appreciate hearing Union County giving support. The other piece that we are just about to go live with is that we have a little baby website that I put together on the slide. It is insufficient, as you can imagine, and so we part of how we've been able to use the support from the Council for the Humanities is creating a more engaging website, and parts of it will be going live soon, and it will only keep getting better, and it will be sort of the heart of when we go looking, putting out the request for proposals for the design of the memorial. That will be a place where that information will be, and also the information that Kristal has been creating learning resources, being able to see videos of the past recitation of names, so all of that. More questions?
In 2 months' time, I shall be 80 years old. I'm now in my 43rd year on the faculty of Rutgers University. And I ain't going nowhere right away. However, my wife and I have 2 daughters, both married, each with 2 children, and they all live in Denver, Colorado. For family reasons, they ended up moving out there. Their homes are 10 minutes apart by car. The 4 cousins are together frequently in and out of one another's houses, and the gravitational pull of Denver grows ever stronger, and at some point I shall have to go there. But I think about my grandchildren and about how things have been developing in this country over the last several years, and I think about my ancestry and where some of that has led, as in concentration camps. And I am fearful for my grandchildren, not just for myself. At the age of 80, there's not much anybody can do to me. I have enough money to live in reasonable comfort. But what about them? And you have children and grandchildren. If we don't do this, the future will be very, very bleak.
First of all, I want to thank you guys, because when Amy sent the email out, it inspired me because I'm a ruling elder at First Presbyterian Church of Elizabeth, which is right a couple doors down. And we have knowledge of 313 enslaved Africans that are buried in our cemetery. They have not been memorialized. And fate has it that now our church campus is being managed by African Americans. And so our quest, starting this year, is to figure out how we get their voices heard. So I came to get ideas and feel inspiration to take back to my church. When you mentioned that one of the governors of New Jersey was the mayor of Elizabeth, it put a huge light bulb in my head. So I will be connecting on your website, which may be way better than anything we have. All we have is that we have 313 enslaved Africans buried on our campus. So you're ahead of us. And I hope that we can connect in some kind of way, because we're committed to getting the voices heard right here in our hometown. So
That's right.
Thank you so much for sharing the stories that you've uncovered, and I hope that we can develop some type of relationship.
Wonderful, we welcome it for sure. And I cannot speak more highly about the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, because they have what are called Incubation Grants. And so they gave us $5,000 the first time, and then they were kind enough to give us a second one. And that really allowed us to take a breather and actually do the work of, let's go out to the community and see, here's a design, what do you think? And they're like, that design does not work for us, but this could. So they gave us the money that we would have been scrambling and spent all our time trying to get the money to do, so we could do the actual work. They are generous, they are wide in their interpretation, they want the humanities, which they understand as history, and they are, I'd say they're a little bit challenged to move outside of certain areas, and so they would welcome a proposal from Elizabeth, is my understanding. So please, reach out to them.
In that connection, the second incubation grant is being used primarily to organize a jury competition for designs. So we're in the process of recruiting judges. We've just about got that nailed down. So, as Reverend Karen said, the request for proposals for people to contribute designs will go out in May, and hopefully by the middle of the summer, or maybe the end of the summer, we'll have a design that has been through a juried selection, through public comments, and what have you. Once we have that design in hand, then the major fundraising and other activities have to go forward, in order to build it. And if we want a decent memorial, it can't just be a sign on a post.
And I'm going to go in a slightly different direction, but sort of coming back and dovetailing to what you said, which is there is a network in New Jersey of folks trying to raise up forgotten history, whitewashed history. I don't want to call it just African American history. It is our history, right? I, as a white person, want to make sure that I don't say, oh, that's not my problem to deal with, right? So, and I don't know if you know, I heard people have recognition about Brian Stevenson, right, and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is in colloquial called the Lynching Museum, right? One of their pieces of work that they're doing, right, is that they have, and I have not yet been there, but I'm going on sabbatical next year, and I'm going to be going down. But they have memorials for every person that they have documented who was lynched, right? And they are asking the counties where those lynchings took place to create coalitions to welcome that memorial back home, to be accountable to, and say, we claim this history. You know, we don't want it to be invisible anymore. And I see people going, yes, I know that that's the case. So there was one lynching that's been documented in New Jersey, Monmouth County. And so there is a group of people who are all about that, a coalition of folks who are working to bring that, you know, concrete, tangible monument that's a part of the Lynching Museum in Montgomery, and bringing it to Monmouth County. So I know, right, and there are other stories I'm sure you can tell, and now we know the story of 313 people buried in Elizabeth, right? And wouldn't it be wonderful if one of the things that came out of this, besides connection and knowledge of each other, relationship, is a map, right? A way that says this is how we remember, right? The more of the story of New Jersey.
I have a question. I too want to congratulate you on having this presentation. I came into the library last week doing some research on our church, and I saw the flyer on the wall downstairs, and I was very excited to come and attend today. And one of the things that has gripped me over the years is that there's very few people in New Jersey that even know that slavery existed in New Jersey. So this is a very important initiative. The second thing is, you know, we talked about Amistad and how important it is to incorporate this history into our schools, because as you so eloquently put it, as I was just thinking it, you said it, is that, you know, slavery is not just black history, it's American history. And it's something that we all share in it. When I look around the room and I see the diversity in the room, I'm really moved by that, because anybody who knows about history and the freedom of slaves knows that, you know, it wasn't black people who freed slaves, right? It was a coalition of people. It was black people, it was white people working together. It was American people working towards the same goals of justice, freedom, and equality of all men. So I'm really inspired by that. But the question that I do have is, how do we keep the momentum going? What's the next move? Because I hear the young lady talking about her church. I hear the brother talking about the Senior Citizens Awareness Coalition. So there's a lot of people in the room that have an interest in trying to keep this momentum going. So my question is, what are the next steps, and how can we come together to try to keep momentum going? How can we come together to help you with your initiative in the church? How can we come together with the Senior Citizens Initiative so that we can, you know, there's strength in numbers, right? Yes. Right. So.
Okay, so Dr. Kahn has an answer.
We have no shortage of things to say because we've been at this for a good while. I mentioned we have bandwidth problems. There are not enough of us to do all the work that needs to be done. Yeah. So if people will come and join us, that's great. Mm-hmm. The more the better. Secondly, political support. It has to become widely known that this is happening. And that political